I was actually writing a novel, and had taken some time off, and I decided to go back to graduate school. I decided that one master degree wasn't enough, so I went back and earned a second and third master degree in city planning and urban design.
Interesting. And then that catapulted you where?
And that actually catapulted me into working for the Denver Office of Economic Development, where I was doing TOD planning, or transit-oriented development planning. At that time, we were just on the cusp of designing the future fast tracks transit expansion,
which has come to fruition in a big way.
Yep. And the idea was really to try to plan for and implement a fair amount of high-density development around transit stations, particularly with high components of affordable housing or income-appropriate housing.
Well, and so fast-forwarding to today, how do you feel about, because you were there in the dream phases.
Yeah.
A lot of what was dreamed about has come to fruition.
I have to say that some of the dreams did not materialize. I think there was a lot of high hopes. What eventually happened sometimes happens in the market system, that higher income folks kind of outbid the housing for low and moderate income folks, and frankly, in my opinion, not enough affordable housing was built around transit stations.
Okay. Well, I appreciate how gently you said what you said. I get it. And, bottom line oriented ventures just don't seem to get derailed.
Oftentimes not. It's I have chosen a relatively new business model that, as you say, is triple bottom line oriented. It's also some people would refer to me as a social impact entrepreneur, or social entrepreneur, as opposed just to a bottom line entrepreneur.
I get that. Now, how do you see this influencing development?
Well, if I have my druthers, I will try to create essentially a new business model that works in is already developed in other businesses, but has been very slow to get into real estate. And my model, I hope to do a little bit of what they call industry disruption.
Well, you certainly will if you are creating income-appropriate edifices as the outcome.
We definitely hope so. And both income-appropriate housing, as well as, I often make the argument that we're going through in Denver not only a residential gentrification and residential displacement, but we're also going through commercial space gentrification.
No doubt, because those rents are rising just as home rents are rising.
Exactly. And so part of my mission as a company is to try to create or preserve more commercial space targeted for community uses. And particularly much of the work I'll be doing is in historically underserved communities, marginalized communities that are most at risk of being displaced right now.
Okay. Now, are there some development projects that you can talk about that you are involved in where this is the end game that you are approaching?
There's a couple of different projects I'm involved in. My major project is we're still working on the development agreements and whatnot, so that hasn't gone public yet. I can tell you general terms, we hope to be producing actually affordable condominiums that for sale condominiums to allow people to have a home ownership opportunity so that they can create equity and wealth, as well as be able to withstand gentrification pressures as they come into the neighborhood.
Interesting. Well, so you feel that you'll be able to do this because why?
Because my name's Will and I have willpower.
That's a good answer. But there's more to it than this, Will.
It is this kind of development is very collaborative. One does not pursue it in a vacuum. And right now we're structured with some very good development partners, as well as hopefully the city and other nonprofit and philanthropic sources of capital. And that's really the only way you can do this kind of development. It usually takes about 3 times as long to put one of these deals together as it does for a conventional real estate deal.
And you feel the extra time is why?
For me, it's it's my passion. As I say, I have a lot of conventional real estate developers who, frankly, would run from the type of deals that I'll be pursuing. But I think these are the type of deals that are needed for communities and are needed for the city to keep a strong, diverse city.
All right. Now, there's a word that is used a lot, kind of overused, sustainable and sustainability. And so you have, some views on that.
I do. I have my company, company's JJK Places, PBC, and we have JJK's six sustainabilities that we believe that all community-oriented development should prioritize. Often when you hear the word sustainability, most people think of green sustainability or economic sustainability. It's my contention that very community-oriented development should have the following 6 sustainabilities, which include social sustainability, cultural sustainability, economic, generational, personal or individual health and wellness, and environmental.
Okay. Now, in including these 6 tenets, these things affect the design and the materials used. Is that it?
Design materials somewhat, but really it's more about programming the space. My overall goal, both in business and in my personal life, can be summarized in that I'm out to use the built environment as a tool to increase community, opportunity, and social equity. And so, to me, real estate is a means to an end, not the end. Most developers really produce space as their end product. They rent or sell the space at the end and move on to the next deal. To me, that's about half the equation. A big part of what my company will be doing is to program space and to really fill it with synergistic uses, particularly in the commercial components of the space that create opportunity for the current residents of a community.
Okay. Now, I've been listening to your language, and so in order to have a programmable space, it must be something that's non-residential, right?
Correct.
Okay. So then you're kind of implying that the projects that your company wishes to do and is currently engaged in are mixed use scenarios, not just commercial, not just residential.
For the most part, correct. I am involved in a couple smaller residential affordable housing projects, but major projects will hopefully be mixed use. That's really where I want to get the synergy of creating opportunity.
Okay. Well, we do know that opportunity in the cityscape is really diminishing due to cost. And, of course, when we look at these things through a purely economic lens, then there's always talk around the gap between income and, market cost. And then how income has not kept up with the rate of inflation, with the increases that income has the benefit of receiving.
Yep, absolutely correct. I sometimes get on my soapbox when people talk about a housing crisis. I will come back and say, frankly, we do not have a housing crisis. Housing and housing affordability are really a symptom of a much larger problem we have, and that's that incomes have not kept up with cost of living and cost of housing. Don't quote me on these dates or numbers, but there was a recent study that I recall over the last something like 25, 30 years, housing costs as judged by the average rental rate of an apartment in the United States has risen something like 77%.
Over this 25 to 30 year period.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And just to put it in perspective, the income levels have risen about 17%.
Yikes. So home ownership and dwellings, let's say, there's like a 10% growth gap there.
Huge. It multiples higher, and that's really, frankly, where our housing affordability problems have risen from. But the fact is, we need to house people, and we're not going to solve the income equality overnight. So the next best thing is to treat the symptom, and so we need to preserve and produce more affordable housing.
Okay. Now, something you said that kind of struck a chord with me. You said, just the cost of erecting buildings, that isn't really what dictates affordability per se, because you said to build a something affordable versus something high end, the cost of the materials is the same.
Probably about give or take maybe 80%, 85% of the cost that goes into a mid-rise or high-rise building is going to be pretty much the same for a affordable product or a luxury residential building. It's really the last maybe 10, 15, 20% of finishes and whatnot that differentiate a luxury building from a affordable building. So the fact is, we cannot produce affordable housing without some sort of either subsidy or other economic incentives that can lower the costs of creating affordable housing.
Wow. Well, now, Will, it seems like you're kind of saying that it's going to take the developer to want, that they would have to want to produce these to do this, but economically there's no true incentive for them to do this. Like, why build a building and I'm only making 25% when maybe I can make 125% profit?
One cannot do the model that I'm doing as a for-profit developer without making a profit. We live in a capitalist society, and
I get that, but you're saying profit margin is
the profit margin
what dictates.
Yeah, and frankly, the profit margin will not be as robust as if I was going out and building a luxury product. That's my own decision. That this is something that I think we need as a society, and I'm just willing to take it on.
Well, for sure. Now, certainly the need has been there. It's a bit overdue, no doubt. How do you see the access to the market? Because there's a qualifying process. There's, always that debt-to-income ratio considerations, that these are all a part of the typical qualifying process. Now, what you seek to do, from what I'm assessing, is create more inventory that's accessible, using your terminology, income appropriate, workforce, that caters to workforce, working folk,
mm-hmm.
and then middle class.
Absolutely. One of the problems that I think people, if they don't realize it yet, is affordable housing, and housing affordability is no longer just a low-income problem, low-income issue. It's definitely become a middle market, a middle-class issue, and I often kid when people don't realize that. I say, well, why is your college graduate son or daughter still living in your basement? Most likely because they can't afford a place to live. That hits home.
Well, certainly. And, we see evidence of this in many of our cities, where people just to be able to be functional in a city's market, rent out rooms in their homes, or, create other income streams, from the home base.
Sure. This kind of all, we've come a bit full circle, because I would say housing stability is really the foundation that all people need for anything else, for education, for access to fresh food, for workforce development, to raise children, etc. If we don't have a stable house, and not necessarily a house, but stable home.
Yes, an address, a place.
Yes, anchored. You really don't. You don't have hope, and I would contend that hope is probably one of the, if not the strongest, human characteristics we need to keep going forward.
Okay. Well, how about you decided to take hope and infuse it in the foundation of your business to create, and introduce this model in a pretty lopsided kind of industry?
Yes, I would say that's somewhat true. That's probably the idealistic side of me. But part of what I'm going to be doing, as I described earlier, I come from a finance background originally, and a typical affordable housing project has probably no less than 8 to 10 levels of financing, different sources of financing to it. The deals that I'm doing, because of the way I'm programming community-oriented space, oftentimes filled by nonprofit organizations, my deals are going to have probably I went out 14, 15 plus levels of funding.
Wow. So that makes it more complicated.
That does make it more complicated, but it also essentially we can do different structures where the blended cost of capital is actually lowered by certain sources, and so we can actually even have market rate capital at smaller proportions, because when it is mixed in with low cost capital, the blended rate is lower.
Awesome. Okay. Well, and not to oversimplify what you said, but just listening to what you said about the collaborative model that the way you are doing business presents, that is not too dissimilar to the collaborative model that people in general are evolving to and adopting, which is the more people you have at the table, the more voices you have, the more strength you have, and that diversity creates the goodwill that you're seeking.
Absolutely. And this is a model that I'll readily admit is evolving, and but so far so good. As I say, I'm doing a couple deals right now, and we've got more in the pipeline. So it's going to be interesting.
Will, you should take a few seconds to shout out how people could read more about your company or even reach out to you.
Sure. We've got a website. In fact, we just have a new website that just went live this morning. So it probably still has some bumps in it, but people can go to jjkplaces.com, and again, the name of the company is JJK Places, PBC is a public benefit corporation. There's actually been some articles that people Google that, they can come up with them.
Good. Now say that website one last time.
Sure. J as in JJK as in James John King Places.com.
Thank you. And listeners, I want to thank you for tuning in, as you so usually do. And we are out of here.
This program is supported by you, the KGNU listener member, and by Save Home Heat Company, providing professional service and installation of heating, cooling, plumbing, and electrical systems. Proudly serving the Boulder-Denver area for over 35 years. More information at savehomeheat.com. BBC is made possible by you, the KGNU listener member, and by Dawson School, preparing students in grades K through 12 through challenging and relevant learning to become creative problem solvers who bring their best to the world. College prep academics, arts and athletics, and hands-on experiential education. More information at dawsonschool.org.
Welcome to Between the Lines, presenting news and analysis of critical issues affecting our region, the nation, and the world. This week we present Ralph Nader, America's leading public interest lawyer and four-time independent presidential candidate, who assesses the Democratic presidential primary campaign and addresses the concern expressed by some corporate Democrats about a Bernie Sanders nomination. Dr. Carla Tate, a member of the Wet'suwet'en Nation in British Columbia, Canada, who talks about the legal and political struggle to stop construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline from traversing native land. And Margaret Poydock of the Economic Policy Institute, who discusses the recent House passage of the Protecting the Right to Organize Act and the links between the decline in union membership and rising inequality in the U.S. But first we begin with a summary of some of the week's underreported news stories.
As
Syria's 9-year-long civil war drags on, Syrian government troops entered the strategic town of Sarakeb, the country's last rebel stronghold, on February 6th, after fierce clashes with opposition fighters as Turkey deployed reinforcements seeking to halt the offensive. Sarakeb, on the Turkish border, is located at the intersection of two major highways, one linking the capital Damascus to the north and another connecting the country's west and east. The push by President Bashar al-Assad's forces into towns and villages in the northwestern Idlib province has triggered the displacement of more than 500,000 people in just over 2 months, compounding a humanitarian disaster in the region flooded by internally displaced people. The battle has angered Turkey and risked a military confrontation between Turkey and Russian-backed Syrian troops. According to the World Health Organization, at least 53 hospitals and health clinics have shut down in the area due to the fighting. With an estimated 300 civilians killed in the fighting since mid-December, the EU has called for a ceasefire and urged warring factions to allow humanitarian aid workers and supplies into the area. Human Rights Watch reports that more than 200 immigrants and asylum seekers who the Trump regime deported back to El Salvador were killed or tortured. The Rights Monitor tracked 138 Salvadorians who were killed by gang members, police, soldiers, death squads, or ex-partners between 2013 to 2019. Most were killed within 2 years of being deported by the same perpetrators who they had tried to escape from in seeking refuge in the United States. El Salvador, with 6 million people, is one of the most violent nations in the world today, with high rates of homicide and sexual violence. According to The Guardian, 11,000 people were registered as missing over the last decade, higher than the number of people who disappeared during the Central American nation's civil war from 1979 to 1992. Much of the current violence is blamed on street gangs, most of which got their start in the U.S. Currently, international law prohibits the U.S. from returning anyone to a country where they face serious risk to their lives. 3/4 of the 1.2 million Salvadorians living in the U.S. lack documentation or have temporary visas, making them vulnerable to Trump administration deportation orders. Between 2014 and 2018, the U.S. deported 111,000 Salvadorians and granted asylum to just 18% of applicants, the lowest rate in the region. Far away from expensive high-tech boom towns in California, New York, or Boston, Minneapolis is now the scene of what may be the nation's most ambitious urban experiment in working to address the crisis in a nationwide shortage of affordable housing. The city has launched an initiative that ends single-family zoning, which has long reserved large sections of the city, like others around the United States, for detached one-family homes. To promote affordable housing, the city is now encouraging the conversion of single-family homes to multifamily dwellings. The city's 2040 agenda creates new protections for renters and places new demands on developers. The Christian Science Monitor reports that new post-boomer communities are rooted in ideals of inclusiveness and diversity across racial lines, among renters and owners, in varied styles of housing units for multi-generational families or cooperative ownership models. Other states are watching to see if Minneapolis's new housing initiative succeeds. For many Americans, middle-class lifestyles have grown harder to sustain as costs of college, healthcare, and housing have risen faster than paychecks. According to the Christian Science Monitor, half of all renters now spend more than 30% of their income on housing. With urban land values rising, these forces transcend any one generation. This week's news summary was compiled by Bob Nixon. For Between the Lines, I'm Leslie Rudden.
After the U.S. Senate impeachment trial, which acquitted Donald Trump without the benefit of documents or witnesses, the nation's attention has now turned to the volatile Democratic Party presidential primary campaign. In the Iowa caucuses, where tabulating candidate votes was a chaotic affair, two candidates emerged in a virtual tie: independent Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and former South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg. One-time frontrunner, former Vice President Joe Biden lagged in fourth place after Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. Going into the nation's first primary election in New Hampshire, the leading candidates were engaged in a pitched battle between Sanders and Warren in the progressive camp, and Buttigieg, Biden, and Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar of the party's moderate wing. National polls on the eve of the New Hampshire primary found Sanders in the lead, followed by Biden, Buttigieg, Warren, and billionaire former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Some press reports maintain that establishment Democrats are in panic mode, fearing that should self-declared Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders win their party's nomination, he'd lose badly to Trump, who signaled that he'd red-bait the Vermont senator at every turn, backed by hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate cash. Your reporter spoke with Ralph Nader, America's leading public interest lawyer and consumer advocate. Ralph, a four-time independent presidential candidate, is author, along with Mark Green, of the new book titled Fake President: Decoding Trump's Gaslighting, Corruption, and General BS. Here, Nader assesses the Democratic primary candidates and addresses the concerns some corporate Democrats have expressed about a Bernie Sanders nomination.
The Republicans never win, Scott. It's the Democrats who lose. They've been losing and losing other than 2018. Nancy Pelosi's cautious approach has lost her 4 out of the last 5 congressional races, starting in 2010. They're always playing catch-up with the Republicans. Republicans beat them to the punch on gerrymandering. They beat them to the punch in so many areas. Lying, they get away with lying. They support programs supported by a minority of the people, and they still win. They're not up to the shenanigans, the brute determination of the Republicans, illustrated by the liar-in-chief, Donald Trump, the relentless, savage sexual predator, the bigot, the racist, and he follows it up with programs, of course. He even can't even face up to helping little kids in the country. Takes away food stamps, takes away nutritious school lunches, replaces them with junk food. And that's the problem. We know what the Republicans are. They're the worst Republicans in history since 1854. It would appall Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, Senator Robert Taft. It's the Democrats that are allowing all this to happen. So the Democrats refuse to look at themselves in the mirror, and the big struggle now that's going on between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on the progressive side and the extremist corporate Democrats, they are the extremists supporting all the positions that are not supported by a majority of the people. They are determined to crush Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and come up with Pete Buttigieg or Joe Biden or even the former mayor of New York, anybody about progressive. That's the struggle going on inside the Democratic National Committee in Washington, and the fooling around already in Iowa, and they're going to count votes in Nevada in casinos. That's a nice place to count votes. They actually have voting precincts in casinos, and that's what did in Bernie. So that's just part of what's going on here. It's really a very titanic struggle between the forces of progressivism, which also get a lot of left-right support, like for a living wage, left-right support, universal health insurance, left-right support, cracking down on corporate crime, breaking up the big banks, living wage, etc. That's what the struggle is. And if they lose to Trump, the worst candidate, I mean, you can't imagine, even for evangelicals, he violates habitually 7 out of the 10 commandments. If they lose to Trump, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a new move for a major third party starting up, just like the Republicans emerged in the 1850s to replace the Whigs.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to ask you about the New Hampshire primary, and what's more important is the clearly pitched battle we have going on now for the soul of the Democratic Party between the party's progressive wing and centrist corporate Democrats, as you said before, Ralph, between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and Mike Bloomberg, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar. Where do you think this fight is headed? It's important because people around the country believe this election in November, if it goes the way of a second Trump term, is an existential threat to democracy itself.
I think that the best ticket is either a Sanders-Warren or Warren-Sanders ticket. And I think they're going to have to seriously consider combining their delegates at the Democratic National Convention. The attack on Sanders is going to be a Democratic socialist. Look, do you want him? And it's so easy to rebut that. I mean, you start out with, how about the corporate socialist? You can't diselect them. They own Washington, and Washington bails out Wall Street. And look what they've done to you. You think they've delivered for you, working people of America? You got the lowest wages in the Western world. You got the fewest solid pensions in the Western world. You don't have paid maternity leave for everyone. You don't have full insurance for everyone. You don't have paid sick leave. You don't have paid daycare. Why does Western Europe have all these? Why don't we have? Because the Republican Party is a corporate state party, and they know how to fight. The Democrats have got to learn how to fight, and that's what Bernie and Elizabeth are trying to do.
That was Ralph Nader, America's leading public interest lawyer and consumer advocate. Ralph is the author, along with Mark Green, of the new book titled Fake President: Decoding Trump's Gaslighting, Corruption, and General BS. Find more analysis and commentary on the Democratic presidential primary by visiting our Between the Lines website at btlonline.org. Another anti-pipeline battle has been underway between indigenous people and a frack gas company. And just as in the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota in 2016, the government has weighed in on the side of the frackers. The Wet'suwet'en Nation of about 3,500 members is located on more than 13,000 square miles of land in the northwestern central interior of British Columbia, Canada. On New Year's Eve 2019, the government of British Columbia granted a temporary injunction to Coastal GasLink Pipeline Ltd., a subsidiary of TC Energy, formerly TransCanada, preventing the Wet'suwet'en from interfering with pre-construction activities in building its 416-mile natural gas pipeline from west of Dawson Creek, British Columbia, to a liquefied natural gas export facility on the Pacific coast. A portion of that pipeline would traverse unceded Wet'suwet'en lands. And on January 5th, the hereditary chiefs of all 5 clans unanimously evicted Coastal GasLink from their territory. Even though British Columbia on paper has the strongest laws recognizing indigenous sovereignty, the government sent 100 heavily armed Royal Canadian Mounted Police into the territory and arrested 6 matriarchs who were